It is 1774, and for American colonists, the time of compromise is over. Shots have been fired. The American Revolution has just begun. The brewing discontent in the colonies had erupted in the Boston Massacre, and after the escapades of the Boston Tea Party, there was no going back for the colonies. While Boston suffered the consequences of rebellion, the other colonies gathered to address the coming war. On September 5, 1774, 65 representatives met in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the Continental Congress. It is the earliest form of American democracy. Among them are John Adams, James Madison, and George Washington. They decide that any British attack on any colony will be seen as an act of war. The colonies would stand together as they prepared for battle.
The Continental Congress formed kind of as an outgrowth of what the colonists believed was British oppression. You know, we had what I guess are more officially known as the Intolerable Acts that had been passed, and really it was formed out of an idea that we've got to be able to negotiate with the Crown. It wasn't formed out of an idea of, hey, we got to break away and be independent. It really started more so as an idea of, can we figure out a way to air our grievances and come to some type of negotiation here. There were actually, coming out of that meeting, there was actually an idea floated that was voted on whether or not to send a message to the king talking about, you know, how much that we wanted to stay as loyal subjects, but why we felt certain things were kind of out of whack. But oppressive action that had continued kind of all began to fall into place and formed greater and greater discontent on the part of the colonists as time went on. We'll pause it.
Across the colonies, citizens began arming themselves. They were not trained soldiers, but normal people, farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths. Men who had never received military training were now charged with defending their cities from attack. They would become known as the Minutemen, the Revolution's earliest militia. They could be called upon if British troops are spotted, but compared to the highly trained professionals comprising England's army, these ragtag soldiers don't look like they stand a chance.
Well, it really didn't look too good because, well, first of all, the British had a long-established military tradition. They had factories in Britain whose job it was to manufacture guns and arms. They had well-trained soldiers, and they also hired soldiers from other countries, such as the Hessians from Prussia. So compare that to the colonists, who had really, what we know today as a militia. They were local people who, in some cases, a few of them had military training. They'd served in the British Army, but most of whom were, business people, farmers, things like that. So it's pretty easy to, stack things up that way. The colonists didn't look like they had much of a chance on paper.
But war with the Redcoats is what they faced. In spring of 1775, the first battles were fought at Lexington and Concord, located in a province of Massachusetts Bay. On April 19th, 900 Redcoats marched to Lexington. Under the orders of Francis Smith, they were instructed to seize weapons and arrest rebel leaders. Among the targeted leaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams were a priority. But the British did not anticipate rebel scouts. Accompanied by William Dawes, Paul Revere sets out to alert the city's militia leaders, rousing them to battle. Dawes covers the southern land route across the Boston Neck over the bridge to Lexington. Revere takes a rowboat across the Charles River. He then safely lands in Charleston and joins Dawes. There, the two alert almost every house. By 5 a.m., 60 militiamen are up and preparing for war. These barely trained farmers would soon face hundreds of experienced British soldiers. At first, battle seems to be at a standstill. Though the rebels are clearly outmatched, neither side makes a move. But suddenly, a shot rings out. No one knows who fired that first fateful shot, but it commenced a swift battle. In the ensuing clash, the difference between the sides becomes apparent. The Redcoats fire in orderly lines and at a much faster rate than the Minutemen. The British then charge with bayonets, the rest of the Minutemen scattered into the woods. Afterwards, representatives meet again in Philadelphia for a second Continental Congress. By this time, the war has been raging for more than a year.
By that time, it's hard to say who exactly had the advantage militarily. I mean, if you add up all the battles in the war, the British may have actually won more battles, if you're keeping count of it that way. But in terms of the key battles that were won, they were won by the colonists. So by the time of the Second Continental Congress, the colonists had won enough significant battles that more and more people who lived on this side of the ocean were on their side. The British were getting discouraged because they were fighting so far from home, and so emotionally, psychologically, the tide may have begun to shift a little bit. I'm not quite sure exactly about the years and so forth. It may have happened a little bit earlier or later than the Continental Congress, but the longer the war went on, the more it ground the British down psychologically.
Unlike the haphazard Boston Massacre, Lexington and Concord proved to be legitimate warfare with Britain. To face the advancing English army, the men agreed to set up the Continental Army. George Washington of Virginia was commissioned as acting commander. To pay for expenses, the Congress authorized the printing of money. A committee to negotiate foreign alliances was also created. But the most significant step forward was voting to declare independence.
All right.
So, certainly during the Continental Congress, there was no abandonment of the possibility of a peaceful settlement with England. There was no abandonment of the idea that we would still be colonists. You know, the process of becoming revolutionaries really happened rather slowly and over time, and was an accumulation of the result of different events that took place. Likewise, the development of the Continental Army was something that slowly developed over time. It was one of the key purposes of the Second Continental Congress. They realized that we definitely needed to create some type of a unified army, and the British were well aware of what was going on at the time. I mean, it's important for people to remember that these things took time, and that there were so many. There was a combination of two things. One, you had so many colonists who were absolutely loyal to Britain and were going to remain loyal even throughout the Revolutionary War, that they would certainly easily report things that they may have heard were going on. But there was also the presence of British troops in peacetime, you know, prior to the beginning of the war. And it would have been impossible for them not to have seen the accumulation of training and things like this, you know. Most states already had their own militias and, you know, Minutemen, if you will. But it just became necessary as they saw Britain become a little bit more forceful about making sure that these, what they were considering to be, you know, almost malcontent, you know, colonists, to make sure that they stayed in line. It became more and more important as Britain ramped up their efforts for the United States, who were becoming the United States, for those colonists at the time, to have a more organized army.
To begin drafting the Declaration, Congress set up a committee of 5. It comprised of John Adams, Robert R. Livingston, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson. Though the committee leaned towards Adams writing the draft, he convinced them Jefferson was the man for the job. The Declaration proclaimed that the 13 colonies now regarded themselves as independent states. It acted as a formal explanation to the July 2nd vote for independence. The grievances against England are clearly stated. Without rights, Jefferson states, the people should be able to govern themselves. This supports his emphasis on popular sovereignty, the principle that the power of the government should come from those governed. He also included the right to abolish an unfair government. The colonists were not taking the chance of being under a tyrannical government again. Congress spends 2 days editing Jefferson's finished drafts. On July 4, 1776, Congress approves the wording and sends the Declaration for publication. Independence has been officially adopted. Though doing so, they knew they risked death.
Well, I can no longer recite the preamble, but the basic idea of being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the idea that these rights are granted or assumed to be true of all individuals, and that the British Crown, by their tyrannical laws and regulations against the colonies, was depriving people of that. So then from there, in the introduction where those concepts are explained, the Declaration becomes a list of very specific complaints against the king and the laws. If you take the time to read them, some of them are pretty interesting.
Bunker Hill is the next major battle. It actually takes place in and around Breed's Hill, which is located in Charleston section of Boston. But the battle is named after the nearby Bunker Hill. It takes place on January 17, 1775. The area surrounding contains many strategic hills, which both Patriots and Redcoats vied for. The rebels could use these hills to bombard Boston with artillery fire, which was then occupied by the British. Under General Gage, the British planned to send reinforcement to the hills, but after receiving words of these plans, General Prescott takes 1,200 men to fortify Breed's Hill. When the British finally arrive at 3 p.m., they are met with a 6-foot-high dirt wall. They first attempt to attack the rebels' left flank. They charge up the hill, 4 men deep and hundreds across. They expect to easily overtake the Patriots, but despite their greater numbers, the colonists have the advantage of height and fortification.
It's interesting to say who necessarily had the advantage at the start of the war. One thing that is so important for everyone to note is that the Continental Army and the people even who were not members of the Continental Army, anybody who was just a militiaman during the time, they had an element of passion on their side that gave them such an edge in fighting. In many ways, what you had was Davy and Goliath the whole time. Britain's the most powerful country in the world. Certainly one of the things that their officers had to deal with was they worried about an unconscious nonchalance about fighting that their troops may have had, because they believed that they were invincible, and Britain had gone to great lengths to make their troops believe that they were invincible. And really there was nothing in terms of true aspects of what gained different militaries respect. There was nothing on the American side that would have caused the British troops to change their perspective about the respect they had for the American troops. And so you could almost call it that they were initially going to be taken lightly by the British troops. And that was always a concern, because despite how any battles went, and despite how valiantly and how passionately the British saw the Americans fight, you were still going to have some people who believed so much so in British superiority that it was going to affect their own level of passion and focus in the fight. There's no doubt that, especially early on in the war, that and even some actions that happened even before the first shots were
It seems the colonists will claim this as a victory until their ammunition runs out. Realizing this, the Redcoats storm back up the hill. After firing rounds, the attack is reduced to close combat, and unlike most rebel weapons, British guns are equipped with bayonets. This time, the Patriots are forced to retreat.
Well, certainly there was Battle of Bunker Hill, which was very early on, and that's the one where the colonists were, the odds were very heavily stacked against them. They were fighting against what was regarded as the greatest armed force in the world, and yet they held their own in that battle, and that proved to a lot of colonists that they did stand a chance in their armed revolution.
British losses are great, though. Securing the hill does not compensate for the many lives lost, many which are officers. And now it is clear to the colonies the British are not invincible. The next significant battle takes place at Trenton, New Jersey. On
Guys,
Christmas Eve,
I'm trying to-
Washington leads his men across the Delaware River. The plan is to overtake
Now.
the Hessian stronghold in Trenton. The Hessians are German soldiers hired by the English. Washington and his men face blistering winds and freezing temperatures as they cross the river. They land at 3 a.m., 4 hours behind schedule. After disembarking, they march to the fort. Barely equipped for the harsh weather, his troops suffer. But they continue onward. The Americans had previously suffered many defeats. A victory against the Hessians was crucial to morale. Soon, they surround the fort. Trenton was a small settlement, and like many colonial towns, it lacked city walls. The Hessian officer, Johann Rall, ignored advice to make fortifications. This would prove to be a disastrous mistake. Washington orders troops to block the Hessian escape route. Under fire from all sides, the Hessians cannot organize. Their resistance collapses. It is a decisive victory for the colonists. Victories like Trenton empowered the Revolution. These battles proved the once ragtag militia had transformed into a legitimate threat to England. They would not stand until they were dead or free, though after these early battles, the Patriots still had a long trek to liberty.